How's it going? Welcome again to our latest episode of The Multitasking Pastor. Our first look, as it was. I'm out again because why not? Because evidently I can't accomplish more than one thing at once. So I'm going down a extraordinarily muddy trail. You can hear it underneath me, I'm sure. But it's not cold enough for anything to have frozen. So it's just a mess. If you are on Contact Watch 2023, they're in today. I got the whole packet. I'm now a person who wears contacts at least most of the time. Anyway, I know all of you really care. So we're continuing our latest saga as we continue to think about the origin story of Jesus, which is I have really enjoyed preaching and reading about and thinking about. I think because I just never have before. Never thought about how the beginning affected his life and the ministry that we get to see. Much like, I think I've said before, much like Noah. You know, Noah emerging from the ark and figuring out what on earth to do and how that would have affected the rest of his life and his children's lives. And we see, if you read the story, you see how kind of tragic and hard that is when he builds the vineyard and, he's drunk and alone and his children find him. And it's a kind of a tragic, sad end to the story. And it also gives us a really good look at what, the realness of these people. It's a PTSD moment. And, you wonder if Noah was able to deal with that until the end of his life. But in a similar vein, that's what we're kind of looking at when it comes to Jesus. And today's story is, I think, a really great one for looking at this origin story the way that we are, because when you're looking at it from that angle, when you're reading the words, this is the Beatitudes story, then it's not hard to see it whenever you're reading it. So while I have a quiet moment here in the woods, let me read it. This is Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. And here we go. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and then he began to speak, and he taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." I think, at least for me, that's the most seamless passage we've had so far that speaks to that origin story. And I think as we think about it here for the next few minutes, I hope that you see the same thing that I do. I'm also going to be walking very slowly because, again, I'm going to show you. That's just mud. Anywho, so here's the first part of this story that I think is important to me. The setting, I think, is important in this way. That area, the area where they think, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, where that took place, it is a absolutely gorgeous setting. I mean, it's like unequivocally, it's, lakeside, it's rolling hills, it's green, there's mountains in the background. I mean, you'd go there on vacation purely for the aesthetic, even if not for the religious aspect of it. And there's something about the fact that the people who are gathered there are like gathered in the beauty of creation, which I kind of find interesting. They are, for all that's hard in their lives, and I think that the people he was talking to are experiencing, some hardship, whether that's spiritual hardship or more like socioeconomic kind of hardship, or just simply the more universal hardship of being under the oppressive thumb of Rome. They are also, he's kind of asking them to look at some of the blessing part, and that blessing part is kind of all around them, and that's just kind of an interesting aspect of it. The other part of this story that I find compelling, really without giving it much thought to the theme, is this wouldn't have made any sense to anybody. And frankly, I don't really think it makes a whole lot of sense to you and I. Because if you came from humble beginnings, or your family was considered blue collar, or any of those things, anyone who wasn't born with a lot of wealth has some level of struggle, and that's true for all of us, or for many of us at least, not for everybody, and we all have individual kind of elements to life that are hard, things where we felt like the other. And if you were listening to my sermon yesterday, I talked about that a little bit. But the Roman Empire, the fact that they were sort of tenants on their own land, the harsh kind of thumb that the religious elite had on the people, the unfair taxing practices, the fact that you could get nailed to a cross for anything Rome felt like you needed to be nailed to a cross for. All of those things were real for the people in a way that certainly is not real for me. And conventional wisdom, and even conventional religious wisdom would tell you that people who are not economically well off are certainly not blessed in any way, shape, or form. It was not evidence that you had done anything good. And so you needed to prove your worth by working hard and by being a good citizen and all of those things, which, kind of keeps people in line. So the fact that Jesus is talking about blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, and in Luke, blessed are the poor, it is a kind of a direct call to a revolutionary type thinking. And no one would have ever really called the poor or the other or the outsider blessed before. It would have that wouldn't have been the norm. And so I think it's also good for us to kind of think about this as a call towards something that feels revolutionary. So I'm noticing, as I pause here for a second, this is about where I had a part 2 last time. That won't happen this time. But some of you did not watch part 2, and if you watched part 2, then you know that I was kind of pondering, I wonder how many people will watch part 2, because I accidentally did something that necessitated that. You won't have to do that this time, but know that there's a second part to last week. Anyway, so I wanted to look at the passage one more time, just because I wanted to now think about it from that origin story perspective. Because if we're going to look at the revolution concept of Jesus, then I think it's probably worth our time to apply what I'm saying directly to the way we read the story, if that makes sense. So again, the two ideas here are the Epiphany ideas. First, the slaughter of the innocents by Herod, and then the fleeing to Egypt, right? And what does that do? What are those two events that history do to the way that Jesus lives in the world? And if that's the way Jesus lives in the world, then that's the way we live in the world. Okay. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Let's just start there. If you're thinking about what I just said, it's not a hard thing to think that that has to be in his mind. Or at least at some point, as he's crafting the message, you would think it would be in his mind. Because if I'm thinking about the hard things in my own life, like if we're having All Saints Day, well, I'm not just thinking about what's happening in front of me. I'm not just the pastor in the room. I'm also the person who has lost someone in the room. You know, I mean, I'm experiencing that in much the same way that you are. And I'm thinking about my own moments of loss and my own grief and what that has done to me over time. And so it's hard to imagine that as Jesus says things like, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn, that he's not thinking about the things in his life that he's already lost. And I am traversing something that is a little more slippery than I'd like. If I wipe out, I'm just going to keep going. So you all get to wipe out with me. But it's hard not to think that he's not thinking or couldn't be thinking about those things, because that's what I would be thinking about if I was in that situation. So then it kind of moves forward from there, and it says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. I wonder how many times that those moments of trauma came into his head whenever he was thinking about that idea. Because again, it would be for me. I think part of the Jesus story is what am I doing this for? Who am I doing this for? Who's inspiring me? John the Baptist calls him the Lamb of God. And a couple of weeks ago I said that title, I think, is very intentional, because it says something about who Jesus is striving to find righteousness for. And I still think that holds some weight. And so I wonder about that as I'm reading this passage. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's the kind of hardship that I think that we see throughout his ministry. I think that he is responding to the people he sees around him who have not received that kind of justice or mercy. You know, it's interesting to think about what our call on earth is, and I was thinking about that a lot this week. Like the whole reason we're here, the whole reason we do this earth thing, and some of it was because we, as a congregation, and me personally, experienced the death of people that we care about this past week. David Doherty, who used to be the music director at our church, passed away, and a few of our members did, and people in their family did as well. And so there are people around me who are experiencing grief uniquely. And the fact that you can go from just living and breathing and doing the whole earth life thing, and then all of a sudden you're just not, is a kind of humbling idea, and can make you feel small, but can also make each moment and hour feel very precious. But one of the things I also think about is, you know, when we are gone, the effect that we had, I think there's a residual kind of effect to us being alive. And sometimes people will remember us by name, you know, our children or our families or our friends or whoever, or maybe history will remember our names. But more importantly, I think even if it's not our names that are remembered, it's the effect that we had on people's lives. And I think part of what Jesus is doing is, you know, if you think about the ripple effect of goodness and mercy, you know, I am good and gracious to you, and then you take that experience on and you are good and gracious to someone else, and it ripple effects like that. Well, I think part of what Jesus is doing in his ministry is ensuring that maybe not the literal memory of each and every person who died there in Bethlehem is recalled, that we would all remember their names, but that the legacy of their innocence and goodness would not be forgotten, and that we would continue to seek mercy for the next people who need it. And I think that, if nothing else, that kind of goes beyond, there's a kind of universality to that, I guess is what I'm thinking, that Jesus is present with us so that, and for us, so that the goodness that we have for each other is passed on and is not forgotten, and that it resonates in a way that perhaps it wouldn't otherwise. And then the passage ends, rejoice and be glad for you, blessed are those people who revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evils against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And some of that is a call to working and living for what is just and what is right, regardless of what might happen to us or to circumstance. But, you know, I think it's also a kind of recall that at some point, those who he has gathered around him, the ministry that he's going to do, you know, at some point will end the way that we know that it's going to end. And, you know, I think that's one of those pieces of it that there's a kind of melancholy, I think, to the ministry of Jesus, even though we know that it ends in Easter morning. You know, it ends in resurrection, and it ends in ascension. I think if you're a person like me who still thinks about the how did we get there kind of kind of feeling, then, the story does have this kind of melancholy to it. And, that's just the reality, I think, of the story. So all of those things are true, or all of those things I believe are true. And I think that the origin story plays into the passage for today in a very, I think, simple, straightforward way. Again, I think maybe in a way that's the most straightforward of any that we have seen so far. And so what does that mean for me? Well, I think that one of the things that we do as, not just as Christians, but I guess as just people, we go out, whoa, I almost did it. We go out in the world and we strive to do well, and we pick careers, and we figure out what our families are going to look like, or how we want to exist in the world, how we want to spend our time. And it's good for us to have moments of reflection. And I think we avoid that often, because sometimes it's hard, or we repress emotions, or we just we try to move on from them. And I think that again, I'll kind of reiterate something that I said in the beginning of this series. I think if our younger generations, our young adults, are good at anything, and I think they're good at a lot of things, but I think if they're good at anything, it's naming the things that are hard and not allowing them to go unthought of, or unprocessed, or just sit there and suffer with them, And I think that's a pretty amazing thing. And I think if you're someone who's trying to connect with a younger person in your life, whether that's a child or a grandchild or a neighbor or whatever, I think that's an important element to this. Because the way that you and I experience faith is that sometimes you and I experience the church or faith as kind of a reprieve from the ordinary world, like a sanctuary. And faith is a sanctuary. But it's also a place where I think people come to not avoid or get a break from the world, but instead, I think, to process it. And church should be a place where people feel like they are being healed by something, or are allowed to think about who they are, or what the world looks like, or how it affects them. I think people need that in their lives. And my hope is that if you're trying to encourage, even softly, encourage people in your life to be, involved with the church, one, I think it's okay for you to be able to admit and recognize the places where we have failed, or I have failed, or people like me have failed. That clergy have not always been the people that we should have been. And that there are at least some of us who are actively trying to do that better. I will spend every day that I get to be a pastor trying to be a safe place for people to be themselves and to work through what they're working through, and not make excuses for the church's failures, because we have been exclusionary, we have been judgmental, we've been all those things, and we don't apologize for them very well. Or we say, well, I'm sorry you had that experience, but my church is like this. No, we need to recognize that We are not the exception. I am not the exception. I can be a part of a solution. I can work towards that. But that's part of why I'm doing this series, is that, one, it gives us a way of understanding Jesus from a different perspective. And if we can understand Jesus from a different perspective, then maybe we can understand ourselves differently, other people, or especially young people, differently. Because they're going through things that you and I didn't go through. And that's okay. You're not always going to identify with what people are going through, but you can empathize with what they're going through. And I think that Jesus was obviously able to do both. He identified with the people in a very unique way because of how he was born, how he was raised, and the traumatic things that happened in his life. But he was also able to show great empathy and compassion and grace because, he was the Messiah, so he had to, because he wasn't like us in that way. So anyway, those are my first thoughts in my continuing multitasking series. I'm almost out of this trail. I didn't fall one time, at least not yet. Thank you for being you. Thanks for joining me along the way. And I will see you next time for another First Look. Take care.